Announce the MC, go on podium.
Right on time, right on time. Merci beaucoup à tous d'être revenus. J'espère que vous avez pu vous réchauffer un peu à l'extérieur. Thanks everyone for coming back on time. To the others, I'm sure they'll come along very shortly. It's a pleasure to introduce this next plenary, but first I'd like to recognize a few people in the room or at this event this morning, including a good number of senators from the Senate of Canada, including the Lieutenant Governor from Ontario and the Parliamentary Secretary for Health and Sports. We're pleased that they and you were all able to join us today. Ça me fait plaisir de passer maintenant le bâton à David Miller, qui va animer la prochaine plénière sur le rôle de l'économie et de combler les clivages. David Miller is a former mayor of Toronto, former chair of C40, which is a grouping of cities tackling a number of very complex issues, and David currently leads the reflection and the thinking and the action around climate and cities. So over to you, David, to kick it off this third plenary of the morning. Merci. À vous.
Merci beaucoup. Good afternoon, good morning, the end of good morning, beginning of the afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to moderate the next panel, which is going to explore the really critical issue facing society globally of inequality and rising inequality. And we know from the statistics that, for example, in the United States of America, since approximately 1980 until approximately 2020, so in 40 years, the share of wealth of the top 1% has increased dramatically. In the US, the figures are from 30% to 39%, and the share of wealth of the bottom 90%, so the share of wealth of almost everyone, which 40 years ago was higher than the top 1%, is now dramatically lower at 23%. The figures are similar on income inequality, and they're very similar in Canada, particularly around income inequality. We see a significant increase in the wealth of society being continually concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. And this isn't just true within countries, it's true within regions, it's true within cities, it's true between countries and regions to some extent. And today's panel will explore three questions and more. Why is inequality increasing? Pourquoi? What are the causes? And what are the solutions? Que faisons-nous contre l'inégalité? Really important and interesting questions, and we're privileged to have an incredible panel today. As you know from the website, so I won't go through all of the resumes, but Pedro Antunes, who's the chief economist of Canada's leading economic think tank, the Conference Board of Canada. Ricardo Hausmann from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, who's the founder and director of the Growth Lab, and formerly a key actor in Venezuela, who will have a very interesting international perspective on all of these issues, as well as speaking to the United States. And Carol Ann Hilton, who is beside me, who is the CEO and founder of Indigonomics, who will be speaking to issues of inequality and hopefully solutions. And what we propose to do for this panel is each of the speakers will speak for a few minutes about the issue of inequality from their perspective as economists, And then we'll have a series of questions and eventually get to questions from the audience participants and participants online. So enough introduction. Thank you all for being here today. Caroline, Pedro, Ricardo, hello. Maybe I can start with Pedro. Pedro, can you speak to this issue of inequality and the increase we've seen in Canada over the past 40 years, and in fact, where Canada is at? And anything else you wish to say, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, David, and well, thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here and participate in this event. I have to say, David, I don't want to disagree with you, but I think there are some different statistics when we look at, essentially market incomes of people and growing inequality in market incomes, and the inequality that we feel when we look at, or that we result with when we look at after transfers and after taxes. So I'll talk a little bit about those trends, but I guess, first of all, I just wanted to ask folks in the audience, just a show of hands, who feels that inequality has been rising in Canada? It's unanimous. It seems unanimous. All right. Well, I guess last night when I was at the panel, Senator Austin talked about truth versus fact. And, I took that to, I really listened in on that, and I thought it was very interesting, because the truth is essentially how we interpret and how we feel about the situation that's affecting us personally. And I think that can be very, very different from fact in some cases. So I want to bring some facts to light as well. And the truth is that if we look at inequality after tax and after transfer in Canada, we look at a variable called, for example, the Gini coefficient, which essentially measures income dispersion in different quintiles, in different income groups across Canada. What we're actually seeing is a problem that was there 25 years ago. 25 years ago, we saw income inequality rising, especially during those early recessions, the recessions in the 1980s in particular. That led to a rise in income inequality in Canada, but it's been pretty stable since then, over the last 25 years. And in the last 5 years, in fact, income inequality in Canada has been declining or trending down slightly. And in the last year, in 2020, we essentially very quickly put in place what is a universal basic income in this country, and that lowered income inequality in Canada very, very, very drastically. So 2020 is an important year in that sense. I think later I'll talk a little bit about where we go from here, and I think there's a lot of concern about income inequality when we look ahead, especially as some of these programs, the CERB and others, come off. Now, income inequality can be very different than wealth inequality, and until very recently, I was of the opinion that perhaps wealth inequality in Canada had been growing as well, and it certainly felt like, especially with the appreciation in asset values, stock markets, or in particular in Canada, real estate values, and I know we're going to have panel sessions on that later in this conference. I was very convinced that perhaps there's a problem on wealth inequality. But when, in fact, we look at the numbers, wealth inequality has done quite well in Canada. And the lowest income quantiles since the 1970s or 80s have actually seen the bigger increases in net value, net assets in Canada. So that's, I guess, a positive thing. And when we look at another measure, I think of, which is really an important measure, it's our mobility, and our intergenerational mobility, and how does Canada perform in that. And I think we're fairly good. When we compare intergenerational mobility in Canada to other, for example, other OECD countries, we're right up there with some of the Nordic countries in terms of that variable. So we shouldn't beat ourselves up too badly. And part of the reason, of course, that income inequality has declined in Canada, especially in recent years, has been old age security, has been the child benefit programs in particular over the last number of years, and as I mentioned, the CERB and other programs in 2020. So just some facts, and not to take away from the truths, because of course the truth is that income inequality and wealth inequality is still very much a problem in Canada. Even though it's not increasing, it's persistent, and it affects different groups and different cohorts across Canada in a tenacious way. When we think about some of those cohorts and some of those folks that are affected, obviously, we go back to that market income that you were referring to, David, where inequality has been growing. And when we look at, for instance, the top 10% of Canadian income earners, that top 10% in that quintile or that group, they actually own about 40% of the income nationally in Canada. The wealth numbers are similar as well. So even though income inequality or inequality in general hasn't been increasing, there's still obviously a very important impact in terms of distribution of that income. If we compare to the US, the top 10% own 50% of that income. And if we compare globally, it's about 53%. The top 10% own 53%. So I know Ricardo and Carol Ann will talk about some of these other groups and some of that redistribution. So I think those are the kind of facts that I wanted to bring. There's other groups, obviously, that I would mention. Maybe I'll get to that a little bit later, just looking at the time. But I think there's one other thing I wanted to talk about, and that is economists, and certainly when I went to school, and if you're looking at welfare economics, economists often talk about Pareto efficiency in welfare economics. And what that means is that if you get economic growth, and economic growth, which is GDP, which is income, essentially. And that is, some groups get more of that income and others don't lose any income. We call that Pareto efficient. And I think in this day and age, in our times that we're living today, we need to think much beyond that. And we need to think about any growth that happens needs to be inclusive across the board. And I think we've heard that from other panels. I think a lot of what this conference is about reconciliation and making sure that we are correcting essentially some of these issues. So I think that's really important in terms of the focus of this panel. And we need to think about what groups may be left behind as we see income growing. I think about in fact, some of the discussion we had earlier around capitalism, I think is really important. I for one, think capitalism isn't necessarily a problem. It may be regulation as well. But think about the tech industry, for instance, and how that might affect groups going forward. The tech industry, which is, has seen some major innovators become all of a sudden major global players, and it's very hard. The barriers to entry are very hard for other industries. So that's taken up a bigger portion of kind of global income, certainly global profits. Tech industry can also have an impact in terms of leaving some workers behind, as all of a sudden we see these increases in technology that displace workers. We want to make sure that we are keeping track of who's being left behind. Similarly with globalization, I think we need to be aware that globalization in general is positive for growth, but it can leave some folks behind. And in Canada in particular, immigration can have some important implications for how we see growth being distributed going forward. And I guess just on a last point, what was I going to say? Yeah, no, I think on the last point, this redistribution, Senator Galvez talked about it, the donut that we have, where we have a bottom and a top, and I think the redistribution can solve a lot of some of these issues. And I know we're going to get into that discussion in a little bit later. So thank you.
Pedro, thanks so much for that introduction and reminding us of the very important fact that while the economy itself may be in creating more inequality, well-targeted government programs can have a very big difference. And I think perhaps we'll get into the solutions. It is interesting, the relatively new child benefit people take for granted, but it's, from my perspective, had a massive impact on people's lives. And we'll see if CERB is followed by some sort of other program. Ricardo, those things are probably not music to your ears. They're details of the Canadian political landscape, but very, very important ones from our perspective. In your work, you have a global perspective. Can you speak to the same question? What is it about our economic systems that have created this divide, even if it's one that by targeted government programs sometimes is addressed?
Pour cette invitation. C'est un honneur d'être avec vous. Et malheureusement, c'est à travers de Zoom, c'est pas en présence, mais j'aimerais bien, peut-être l'année prochaine, à un autre moment, d'être chez vous. Et c'est un très beau pays, c'est une très belle ville. Et c'est dommage que je ne peux pas être là avec vous aujourd'hui. Thanks for this invitation and thanks for the question. I'm speaking to you here from the US, and when you look at Canada from the US, you know, it's very easy to look at it with some degree of envy, especially on issues of inequality. Because as you know, the US is substantially more unequal than Canada. We put some numbers. Gini coefficient in the US is about 0.42. Gini coefficient in Canada is about 0.33. It's a huge distance. And so, you know, one important question before you ask the question, what can we do to improve? You know, ask yourself the question, how is it that you have contained inequality so much better than the US? And you know, learn from your own experience and your own things that seem to have worked for you. Now, if you look more globally, obviously, I'm from Venezuela, I'm from Latin America. Latin America is, depending on your choice of gender, is either the king or the queen of inequality worldwide. And you might ask, and when we measure it that way, we're asking, you know, why are those societies internally so unequal? But if you look more globally at the world, you know, the world is unequal. In what sense is the world unequal? In that, you know, depending on where you're born, has a huge predictive power over how much your income is going to be. If you ask yourself the question, two randomly chosen persons in the world, what accounts for their difference in expected income? 60% of that difference is explained by the fact that they were born in different countries. So a huge portion of the global inequality is inequality between countries. And the first explanation for why there's inequality between countries, why, say, Canada is approximately, on average, about 100 times wealthier than Malawi. It is not because Canada is extracting resources from Malawi. It's just that Canadians are so much more productive than people in Malawi. And the reason why they're so much more productive is because they work with much better technologies, with much better forms of production, of organizing production, of endowing production with equipment, with procedures, with protocols, with rules, with routines that make people more productive. So I would put it to you that at the global scale, inequality, global inequality is associated not with the fact that the global pie is very poorly distributed, but that people in different places bake pies of very different size. So in some parts, they bake really, really small pies, and it doesn't matter really how you slice that pie, everybody's going to get a very small share. And in other countries, they bake very, very big pies. Okay, so that's one sense of global inequality, and that's essentially explained by inequality in productivity. Okay, and inequality in productivity, I would argue, has to do with inequality in the adoption and adaptation of technologies, of forms of producing, of forms of organizing production. That is also true within countries. There's a lot of inequality between regions. For example, the state of Connecticut has an income per capita on average, which is twice that of Mississippi. But the state of Nuevo León in Mexico has an income per capita which is about 8 times that of Chiapas in Mexico. So there's humongous differences in inequality by region, which, when you work it out, are also related with very large differences in productivity. You know, in Nuevo León, they're exporting cars, they're exporting printers, they're exporting electronics, they're doing a lot of very complex stuff, and in Chiapas, they're exporting coffee and some other agricultural products and stop counting. Okay? There is also further inequality even within states and regions, right? And even within cities, right? There's some parts of society that are working in aerospace, they're working in the car industry, they're working in the medical industry, they're working in some very productive industries, and other parts of society are, you know, self-employed, working in, you know, informal retail activities, etc., or informal services. They cut your grass, and there's an enormous difference in income by the kinds of activities that people do within cities, within regions, and so on. So I would put it to you that, to a first approximation, a lot of the inequality that you find in the world is not inequality in sharing of the pie, it's inequality in the size of pies people bake. Now, why do these differences in productivity exist? Why don't people just opt into more productive activities? There is where interesting challenges start appearing. Industries that are going to make complex things require access to people with very diverse knowledge. So, you know, if you're going to make a movie, you need people who know about photography and, you know, cameras and sound effects and visual effects, and it's casting and writing and soundtracks and original music. You see it at the end of the credits in a movie. It's an amazing number of people with different skills that have to come together to make a product. And typically, those products are going to be done in places that have that diversity of skills. And so typically what you'll find is that these complex industries only happen in places that can bring together all that variety of skills that are needed to make a complex production. And people that want to participate in complex production have to be able to get there. So, for example, one of the major issues in Latin America is that people, given the structure of cities, given the structure of the transportation system, given their endowments in terms of having or not having cars, having or not having access to urban transport, the quality of urban transport, just getting to where these formal jobs is too far away. It's too costly in terms of time, in terms of the share of your expected wage that you're going to be spending in getting to work, that people opt out and prefer to work on their own in the informal sector at very low productivities. So this goes to the essential point that what limits the diffusion of technology is the inability of people to connect to those places or to those activities that are highly productive, which tend to be activities that combine a lot of knowledge that is spread across many people and that are brought together in the process of production. So I would put it to you that the challenge of inequality is really a challenge of inclusion, of allowing people the possibility of participating in the modern economy, in the advanced, more complex part of the economy, spreading that economy so that it includes more people. So in my mind, we have to make a major distinction between policies that attempt to tackle inequality through redistribution That is, take outcomes being unfair or whatever, they're what they are, and you're going to compensate people for their, in my mind, for their exclusion. So redistributive policies are policies that compensate people for the fact that they're poor because they're excluded. And I want to contrast that with an alternative set of policies that are policies for inclusion. It's not palliative of saying, okay, well, since you were excluded and poor, here's a check. It's no, these are investments that we are going to do either in yourself or in your ecosystem, in your environment, so that you can effectively participate. And I'm going to leave it there. That's, in my mind, an important distinction, and you can guess where my heart is on the way forward. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Ricardo, thank you very much for that really clear and brilliant explication of your view, which, if I can summarize a bit, is really place-based and inclusion-based. And to solve the economic divides, we need policies that include, as opposed to policies that compensate. And I would, for people here and online around the world, both Pedro and Ricardo mentioned the Gini coefficient. It's been over 40 years since I studied economics, but I believe I'm right in saying, first of all, it is the leading simple measure of income inequality, but I believe I'm right in saying the closer to zero you get, the more equal your society is, and the closer to one you get, in fact, one means one person has everything, everyone else has nothing. Is that about right? So we want to be low. Great. Well, I look forward to the next part of the conversation with you, Ricardo, but I think also by speaking to this inclusion-exclusion issue, you've really been a great segue and introduction for Carol Ann. And Carol Ann, I'd just like to ask you about your perspective about the economic divides. Where do they come from? Why? And then the next question, of course, will be, what do we do about it? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to come here today, and thank you for the previous speakers. Carol Ann Hilton, I come from the New Channel tradition, the West Coast here in Vancouver Island. My people are whalers, and I come from the powerful legacy of that. In our economy, in our traditional economy, when a hunter went out and got a whale, how it was distributed as a topographical representation of the territory and the houses in that territory. The concept of resources, distribution, income, all from an Indigenous perspective. The functionality of economy was based in abundance, and it was based in the ability to give. I could speak extensively on the Indigenous perspectives of wealth, but I think it's important to spend time today speaking directly to the fallacy of the concept of the divide in the Indigenous economic relationship. It is essential to understand that the divide that we see of the Indigenous population was by design. To understand and build on the legacy of this country that tells us of the tensions between the English and the French, when in reality, the early regulatory structures and legal framework of this country was entirely shaped on the exclusion of the Indigenous population. The disinvitation to Indigenous peoples in the economic table that shaped this country is the divide that we're referring to today, to the effects of that divide. To essentially understand that the use of the Indian Act as a system of economic regression of the Indigenous populations has existed largely and entirely within its existing form, right from the first regulatory framework of Canada itself until today. To understand and further realize that the Indian Reserve in itself also required the economic isolation of the Indigenous population. To understand the system of economic isolation of the Indigenous people is what we look at of the concept of the socioeconomic gap today. The realization of the socioeconomic gap is the polarization of the Indigenous reality, Indigenous worldview, and downplaying of Indigenous economy itself. The uptake of Indigenous economic strength today, the realization of the oncoming insights into what does Indigenous economic power look like. Indigenous economic power is not going to be solely reflected in incomes of Indigenous families. The shortcomings of that measurement and the shortcomings of that perspective, it is essential to understand the characteristics of what is shaping Indigenous economic power. In 2019, the Indigenomics Institute identified that a $100 billion Indigenous economy is not only possible, but essential for Canada's future. I'm often asked where $100 billion came from. To understand in a pre-COVID environment that if Indigenous peoples make up close to 10% of the entire population, to look at the correlation of the potential of 10% correlation of Indigenous economic activity, we come to a $100 billion Indigenous economy. To understand that essentially, the advancement of the Indigenous relationship over time, what is specifically expressed in the legal field is then expressed within the economic field. To understand that is a structure of emerging space of Indigenous economic power, we move way beyond the limitations and confines of how we describe the Indigenous relationship outside of an income description. The fallacy of the socioeconomic gap itself is a story that is told about how Indigenous peoples are underperforming. The racist underlying tones of understanding and seeing Indigenous peoples as a cost on the system, instead realizing the actual economic space that Indigenous peoples are creating. To be able to bring into focus that essentially the emerging structure, features, and underlying fundamental essence of a $100 billion Indigenous economy requires us to look at these increased Indigenous economic activities and where those are happening. When we look to examples such as clean energy, we see that there's close to 2/3 of over 600 nations in Canada that have some shape or form of clean energy projects. When we look to concepts of equity ownership, we're looking at hundreds of billions of dollars of Indigenous inclusion that while the space emerged within the legal field that required Indigenous peoples to be able to facilitate consent, authority, inclusion, it is in this place that we realize that the divide will be closed. The requirement and uniqueness of the Indigenous relationship in its placement, while in its evolution has largely been seen through the lens of the Constitution, when we look at now through the lens specifically of the economy, and we tie Canada's future to Indigenous economic prosperity, that is the intersection that we're at. The realization of the uptake of Indigenous economic power, its structures, its features, and characteristics. The investment into Indigenous businesses is unfolding daily. To understand is specifically that in being able to build that economic space, to look at the early measurements of Indigenous economy, while largely based within the constructs of GDP and income, the realization that the space for actually measuring Indigenous own source revenue, measuring assets, and measuring the investment environment leaves the space for stronger meaning, stronger metrics, and stronger understanding of Indigenous economic power. I started speaking previously of that concept of Indigenous economic isolation. In the book that I wrote, Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table, I referred again to my own New Channel tradition, where here in British Columbia, the reserve systems were so small, it isolated us from our lands, and we had the inability to actually establish an economy on the reserves. Further regulations isolated us from the ocean or from any ocean economy and our traditional fishing. When we took Canada to court, we essentially won the right to a commercial fishing. In doing that, everyone at that economic table had to move over. There's continuous streams of narratives of how Indigenous peoples are creating the space at the economic table for ourselves. It is when the realization of the expression of our ability to facilitate our inclusion in our local economies, in our local sectors and industries, that we will realize that that will be directly reflected back into incomes. Finally, I wanted to refer that when the school year got out, I saw this story on social media, and it was of a small nation, I believe it was in Saskatchewan. And at the end, the Indigenous school board, so the authority existed within the Indigenous school board. When the children got out, the nation bought the entire set of children bicycles. And it was such a beautiful thing to depict this representation of childhood memory of the simplest thing of a bicycle. I suggest that that Indigenous jurisdiction and authority of education aligned with economic development is that alignment in itself is what has allowed that space to be able to look at the future for Indigenous children. Finally, I posit that this country exists on two sets of economy. There's economy as we know it and is described and measured as GDP, and finally there's Indian Act economics. And while we see that there are portions of the Indian Act that have been able to be removed specifically in regards to land designation, the realization that the form of Indian Act economics itself is actually the divide and the cause that we should be talking about, the Indigenous economic regression as the cause of Indian Act economics. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Caroline. You clearly, your comments, powerfully put, clearly resonated very much with the participants here in the room, and I'm sure online on everywhere that the Victoria Forum is being watched today. I think I'd like to follow up about how we address these divides. The question that I was going to ask the panelists is, what is your perspective on how to bridge these divides? How do we need to change our economic systems to accomplish this? But I think it's appropriate, Caroline, to start with you. One of the points I noted down that you said really powerfully was about our ability, meaning Indigenous people, our ability to facilitate our inclusion in local economies, and that ultimately that ability in many ways depends on the legal structures, particularly the Indian Act, which created structures that prevented First Nations from having an ability to facilitate their inclusion in local economies. So I want to just ask you about your thinking of what are the building blocks of trying to fix this? You had some interesting examples of places where there is hope and progress. If the Senate of Canada is listening to this, what are the next steps that need to be done to fix that underlying structural problem, legal problem, and then the practical problems, if you can fix that, of facilitating this ability to facilitate our inclusion in local economic activity?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, first of all, we have to acknowledge the inheritance that each one of us has come into the lens of seeing the Indigenous population. We inherited the perspective of the Indian problem, and we see the silver thread of that narrative go across the entire development of Canada itself. It's time to stop trying to fix us. It's time to be able to understand the emerging space of Indigenous economic power is being built by Indigenous nations. The growth of the Indigenous economy cannot exist within government programs and services. The institutions to support Indigenous economic growth and design are essential. Second to that is that Indigenous programs and services do not design for Indigenous economic growth or participation. To be able to facilitate the leadership, the structures, and the tools of Indigenous economic design at a national level means Indigenous-led institutions. Indigenous-led, we're seeing the development of infrastructure funds, housing funds, and actual authorities that support the design of Indigenous economic growth, and that's where we will see that success. Thank you.
Fantastic, very particular and clear. Maybe I'll go to Ricardo. Ricardo, can you speak to, you also had what I would call a kind of place-based analysis. Can you speak to also, how do we start bridging those divides? If the divide is about productivity, and part of it is because people simply don't have the opportunity to access more productive jobs because they're stuck for many reasons in the place they live, whether it's a country, a neighborhood, a region that has less opportunity. What are the steps that we should be taking to fix this?
Sure. It depends on, thank you for your question. It depends a little bit on the level at which you want to think about it. So if you're thinking about the level of a poor country, you really want to facilitate, emphasize the adoption of technology. And technology is really three forms of knowledge. Knowledge in the forms of tools and equipment, knowledge in forms of codes, recipes, formulas, routines, how to do manuals, and knowledge in the form of know-how and brains. Now, tools and codes are easy to move around. You can put tools in containers and ship them. You can put codes on the web and share them. Know-how in brains is more complicated because it only gets into brains through a long process of repetition, imitation, practice, and so on. So one of the easiest ways to move technologies and to move know-how is by moving the brain. And human mobility has been extremely important for technological diffusion. And here, many developing countries have extremely restrictive immigration policies, particularly biased against high-skill immigration. Because they're saying this country is for us, and the good positions, the distinguished positions in our society are for our people, and we don't want to share them with people from abroad. But in that process, they limit the possible entrance of knowledge. For example, in countries that I've worked on, like Panama, you have to be a citizen to be a university professor in a public university. So if you think that universities are places where technology might help technology diffuse, well, if it's closed to foreigners, then there's no way to close the gap with the rest of the world. If Harvard had those policies, I wouldn't be there. So that's one thing at the global level. Also, you want to, a lot of technology exists in firms, so you want to attract investment. It's not, if you focus yourself and saying, no, we have to be the owners of the companies there, well, you may not be able to put together those teams, those firms, without engaging with people who are already doing these things outside. So, openness to investment and so on are key. If you look at a more regional level or a more local level, I think obviously inclusion into education is very important, but inclusion into the labor market is very important. And here, what I find in many places is that governments have said, the right to housing is important. We have a deficit in housing. Let's build housing for poorer people. And let's build houses of a minimum size and qualities, like running water, electricity, and so on, at a maximum price so that we can afford a maximum number of them. And they end up building public housing in extremely disconnected areas where there's no possibility of accessing the labor market. Or they underinvest in transport infrastructure because they are investing in roads, and in a road you have a car takes so much more space per capita than a bus, and there's no urban transport. There's only like individual transport, so people end up being excluded through lack of mobility. So urban design, housing policy, transport infrastructure are really key for allowing people to participate. There's also, obviously, discrimination a potential issue, right? That if you are unwilling to hire people of a certain ethnic origin, of a certain race, etc., then even if they had the skills, even if they had whatever, they are not included. I want to say I've worked on some countries with significant indigenous populations, say in Latin America, and I find an enormous difference in performance. In a typical village populated by indigenous people in Mexico or in Central America, they would have an economy based on production of corn and beans for self-consumption. So they are somewhat autonomous. They produce for their own consumption, typically corn and beans. A few animals there, but that's the typical structure. People leave the village to try to work somewhere else and send remittances, and then they get some government transfers. But the more successful villages, towns, they've gotten into some new industries. For example, the town of Sinacantan in Chiapas got into producing flowers for the Mexican market, and they thrive vis-a-vis other villages nearby that are into corn and beans. There's a cooperative, an Indian cooperative in Guatemala called Cinco Techos, and they found out a way of selling fresh produce to Tesco in London. And they solved the logistical problem of how can you make something in Guatemala and it to appear fresh at a reasonable transport cost in England. Well, that cooperative is incredibly wealthier than its neighbors, and I've been there, talked to the children of that cooperative, and their aspiration is not that they're going to make more vegetables for Tesco. Their aspiration is that they're going to study English, go to university, and maybe work in business process outsourcing in call centers or something else. I remember another town in Chiapas called Miguel Alemán, and they had, what they call in Mexico, usos y costumbres, traditional, Indian property rights that are communal. So this group decided to bring together all their communal land and create on top of it a corporation. To sign a contract with one of the major fruit companies in the world, to get some technological transfer and to start producing fruits for that multinational, and to package and to select and so on with higher technologies and so on. And you see that village, town, and you compare it with the neighbors, and again, it's hugely different. So I think that inclusion has to do with changing livelihoods, changing the way people earn a living by getting them into more productive activities that connect to the world. So it's not about us alone being independent. Autarky has never led to prosperity. It's about they can find a role for themselves, serving the needs of the world by making things that the world finds valuable and that they can do in an effective and productive way.
So thank you very much, Ricardo, for those really interesting examples of creativity and locally driven. Ricardo, can you hear me? Well, I was going to ask you a follow-up, but I'll say it. Locally driven efforts, particularly in indigenous communities. And that follow-up, I was just going to say, it struck me that from an urban perspective, and of course, as a former mayor, I think a lot about these issues from a city-urban perspective. Ensuring that people are able to get around a city through excellent public transport, I think speaks to your earlier issue about people being excluded from jobs that they might seek or wish to, if it's simply cost prohibitive or time prohibitive, because you don't have proper transport. And from a perspective of a conference which wants to speak to solutions, that might be one thing that comes out from your comments. Pedro, I heard two perspectives. Wanted to turn to you. You know, you're the senior economist at the most important think tank in Canada. Can you speak to what you see as solutions? And can you also speak to a question I think your first answer spoke to when you push back against my characterization of increasing inequality? I would argue our system is creating increased inequality, but in Canada we have some remedies. If the system's creating increased inequality, should we be thinking about changing the system? There are economists who argue that this is necessary, you know, ecological economists who say we shouldn't be focused on growth as well. So in your answer, if you could think about that question as well, I think people will be interested to hear your comments. And I should say, after this intervention, there will be an opportunity for questions if people have them, including online. We do have the ability to take online questions. I'll look to the mics, and if there's nobody there, I've got lots of questions. We could be here for months, but we won't be. So Pedro, your comments.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, I guess just on the kind of solutions, and this goes a fair bit to, in fact, both the other panelists' points, but it is about, you know, I think our ability to generate that pie. And, you know, Ricardo talked very, very specifically about differences in the sizes of the pie. I think in Canada, when we think about what is adding to our economic, how should I say, our incomes, our prosperity, you know, certainly I simplify it, and a lot of economists simplify it to kind of what we call the factors of production. And when we think about that, we can think about how a firm produces income or output or whatever you want to call it, and that is with, first of all, their human capital and with their physical capital. And Ricardo made the point as to how these things mix to create, you know, essentially more productive outputs. So the productivity aspect is really important. So the solution to me is essentially free access to education, making sure that we have the ability to participate more fully in the labor market, that we have those opportunities that you talked about. Physical capital, it's been a problem for Canada. The Conference Board has been talking about this for decades, and many others around investing in physical capital. We're not seeing that happen as quickly as we'd like to see. We're seeing, in fact, a regression in our ability to invest. And when I say physical capital, I'm not just talking about mines, I'm talking about technology, investing in research and development. This kind of investment is lagging in Canada, so we need to keep that a focus on that. And I think those are the keys, really, to the other part of the solution, not just taxation and redistribution, but the keys to ensuring that we have access and full access, especially to education. Healthcare, I think, is really important. Free access to healthcare is one of the reasons Canada does fairly well on some of the measures we talked about. Access to dental care, I remember being very involved in kind of what prevents lower income adults, certainly from getting into the workforce. And I'm not just here touting the liberal programs here, but I think dental care is a really important aspect as well. And of course, in terms terms of access to the labor market, enabling women to get more fully in the labor market. I think the daycare program that is coming is another good solution. So, you know, I think Canada is doing a lot of the right things. What could we do more? We often talk about taxation. Taxation is, economists feel, often very inefficient. It's difficult to do well. It has all sorts of unintended consequences. But there is a lot of economists that talk about leveling the playing field in terms of inheritance tax, and that how should I say, that effect of wealth being passed on generationally that impedes our ability to see better intergenerational mobility. So, you know, I think that's one aspect. We often talk about taxing wealth and our high incomes. Perhaps taxing wealth is very difficult, but taxing inheritance is something perhaps that we could look at in terms of policy going forward.
We're going to go to a question, then I have a follow-up on that if there's time, but we'll see. Yes, you have the floor for a question. If you could keep your question to about 30 seconds, it would be appreciated. And I don't know what the routine has been so far, but feel free to introduce yourself and say who you are and where you're from if you're comfortable doing that. We can hear you. Thank you very much for the question. I'm not sure if that got heard over the mic. It was heard well in the room. So just to summarize for those online, the question was about Indigenous education, particularly given some of the fastest growing school districts are in First Nations and on First Nations territory. How do we ensure that the resources get to those students and schools in order to give young people the best opportunity? Is that a fair summary? So I'm going to go to Ricardo first, and you know, how to, in the context of the kind of economic thinking you're doing, where there are inclusion issues, often place-based, and exclusion issues, really. Building inclusion, part of it is through education. How should governments be mobilizing resources to solve this very important problem of an appropriate allocation of resources? Do you have a thought based on your work?
Yes. Let me talk a little bit about my experience in South Africa, where there's an enormous inequality between ethnic groups, you know, cemented in, you know, in many decades of apartheid and colonialism, that, you know, has been attempted to be reversed over the last 30 years since the end of apartheid. And, you know, obviously it's relatively easy to equalize spending between groups. Say, you know, you can target fiscal resources so that they're more or less proportional per capita. But it's different if you're talking about the ability to produce the educational service. And you say, okay, how do you produce the educational service? And say, one of these more relegated parts of South Africa. Well, part of the problem became that people in those areas would not, or at least their political leadership, would want the teachers to be of people from that area. But there was a huge scarcity of people who could teach math or physics or whatever that were under the condition that they be from that particular ethnic group. In some sense, it was the unions, the teachers' unions, that were pushing for that policy. But people with that level of education of that ethnic group probably would have had other options in society and not necessarily want to provide not to have an educational career. So actually, the only way to it's very important to focus not only on the equality of budgetary resources, but on what can effectively provide a quality education in those areas. And it may be that the only way to provide quality education in those areas is by involving people who are not from those areas. And that I found to be a really important stumbling block in South Africa.
Caroline, do you have some comments? A very specific question about British Columbia, but I think it's a question that applies certainly across Canada and around the world.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for that question. I think that it's twofold: a transformative agenda or mandate for increased jurisdiction of education for Indigenous nations, and the second would be the actual implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. So the alignment of increasing Indigenous jurisdiction and authority, specifically within education, is where we'll start to see where that gap is beginning to be addressed. Thank you.
Pedro, you look like you've got an addition.
Well, I would just say that when we look at where Canada is competitive and where we've done well in the last decade or 20 years even, the growth in our economy has come from the knowledge side of the economy. It's the knowledge economy that's been driving employment. It's things like professional, scientific, technical services. So I think, when we think about our education system, we need to be considering the sciences and the maths and those, how should I say, those skills within that educational system for First Nations and more broadly. And I think there's a definite gap in terms of First Nations and Indigenous people's success rates in those fields.
We have another question at this mic. I'll go to that, and then we'll see how we're doing for time. If you could keep your question about 30 seconds, it would very much be appreciated.
Thank you. My name is David Dunn. I'm a professor at the Gustafson School. I'm struck in this discussion by how little comment there has been on what might be termed non-economic costs. So the kinds of costs that economists don't traditionally measure. For example, you could reduce inequality by providing people with jobs or by creating more migrant laborers, right? So that people would have jobs some way away, but might be separated from their families for potentially years on end. This happens around the world. So there's a non-economic cost there, the non-economic cost of losing traditional ways of life, etc. And there's been very little discussion of that and how that relates to equality, and I'd love to hear something from any of you about that.
All right, powerful point. We've been discussing, perhaps in an overly technical fashion, the numbers and the legal systems that have disempowered people. And there are non-economic costs if somebody, for example, moves to another country to make remittances or another town. So would any of the panelists like to chip in on that question? How do we factor in restructuring the economy, things simply beyond the numbers? And it does go back to a point I made earlier. The ecological economists would argue that we have one planet and we don't include it, and we're consuming more than one planet now in Canada. I've forgotten the figure, but I think it's like Canadians consume 7 planets each or something the equivalent of. How do we factor into the decisions we make about how to structure our economy these other things that maybe aren't measured, but like the value of family, the value of community, the value of history and a way of life, and the value of our planet? Any thoughts? And feel free, anyone, to start, and Ricardo's got a comment, and it's easiest to start with you, so you have the floor.
So first of all, I mean, that's a great question and a great reframing of the question also. Let me start by saying that one of the forms of inequality that I think we haven't talked about, but I think it's really key, is sort of like the equality of dignity. That all humans have an equal dignity. And that may or may not translate into differences in incomes earned, but it translates in equality not only before the law but before each other, and the respect that we give each other. So I think that's a very important element even of well-being, that you feel you have a dignified life and that you are treated with dignity. So I think that's a very important one. On the issue of migration versus, say, local development, obviously, if you migrate, there are costs and benefits. You lose your contact with your social network, with your culture, with your language. You go to a different place, you might feel isolated, you might not be treated with the same dignity, with the same recognition and respect. But you're going to learn a lot of stuff that you would not have learned at home. And that stuff you learn, it might become a really important asset. And we've been doing a lot of work on the importance of diasporas in terms of enabling local development. There's very interesting work that's being done at all of the scales of, at all skill levels, And my friend from Berkeley, Annalise Saxenian, has these beautiful books on how, say, the Indian diaspora, the Taiwanese diaspora, the Korean diaspora in Silicon Valley impacted events back home. So there is a role of people migrating out, being exposed to new kinds of jobs, new experiences, accumulating new skills, and those skills benefiting back the community at home, connecting them to opportunities that would not have otherwise been there. But obviously there are, we see now massively in Central America, people trying to leave the country to find some kind of job in the US. There you would wonder what could be done so that people don't have to incur the risk of the kinds of risks that people are taking in order to have activities at home. And there I think that some of these place-based policies could be potentially important, and they could be supported by trade policy. In the 1980s, there was a very interesting, and I would characterize that as successful experience, for a little bit all the wrong motivations or reasons. The U.S. was concerned about the drug trade, and they were also concerned that the garment industry in the U.S. was going to lose out to Asia, and that maybe they couldn't sell the garment industry, but maybe they could save the textile industry of North Carolina. So they ended up signing the Caribbean Basin Initiative, where they gave trade preferences to Central America and the Caribbean if they made garments with essentially North Carolina textiles, US textiles. And my reading of the evidence is that that was very effective in terms of industrializing Central America, in terms of moving them into new sources of revenue generation and employment. And that was sort of like an international policy that facilitated local jobs. And I think, that a little bit is in this AGOA, that the US has this African Growth and Opportunity Act that gives trade preferences to some regions. That something in that direction, and I would enhance them a little bit, it could stem, the flow of people migrating out, and would facilitate technology flowing in. Those are just some comments.
Ricardo, thank you very much. I'm going to have to end the response to this question there and thank the panelists and thank the questioners and thank everyone who's here today and everyone listening online. It's been a fascinating and powerful discussion, and I think we've heard different perspectives from each of these people based on their own background and thinking, but some commonalities around the importance of our ability to facilitate our inclusion in local economies, which starts with Indigenous people, but I think speaks to workers and people in many places around the world, building an economy actually in the interests of people. I think it's a valid goal, and we've got some insights today about how we can do that. So thank you very much to the panelists. If we could show our appreciation, please.
This morning's session. The table is set, literally and figuratively, for great conversations over lunch. Merci beaucoup aux participants en ligne. A little bit of housekeeping. Lunch will be served in the cafeteria in the back until 1:30, at which point roundtables will resume between 1:30 and 3. The topics are forced migration and displacement of peoples, getting to net zero and climate positive, business and business schools, bridging divides, a health break, resuming at 3:30 with building resilient and sustainable communities, inequitable access to quality health care, or should be equitable, inclusive housing and jobs, and student voices. That will finish at 5 o'clock, and the shuttle will be going back downtown at 5:30. Merci beaucoup pour un avant-midi riche en échanges, riche en idées, et au plaisir de vous revoir cet après-midi. Thank you.